Kids can be brutally unforgiving, especially when your life doesn't fit neatly into their polished suburban mold. So when a 10-year-old boy stood up in front of his class and admitted his dad was a biker, the whole room exploded into cruel, mocking laughter. They pictured some pudgy weekend warrior with a bell on his handlebars. What they had no idea was coming, what none of them could have imagined, was a fully patched outlaw motorcycle club about to roll straight up to their school. And by the time it was over, every single one of those laughing kids and their wealthy parents would understand exactly what they'd misjudged. So stay with me, because where this ends is going to give you chills. The school was the kind of place where success got measured in zip codes and the brand of SUV idling in the drop-off line. Tucked into a wealthy little enclave in Northern California, its hallways smelled like floor wax and quiet privilege. And for a quiet, watchful 10-year-old we'll call Danny, walking through those double-glass doors every morning felt like crossing into enemy territory. Danny didn't belong, and he knew it. He didn't have a father in a glass-walled corner office. He didn't spend his weekends at the country club. He was an observant kid with scuffed sneakers and a faded denim jacket he wore like a piece of armor. And on this particular Friday, the school had reached the climax of Career Week. The assignment sounded harmless enough. But for Danny, it was a minefield. My hero, my heritage. Every student had to stand up in front of their classmates and present what their parents did for a living. Visual aids, a short speech, the whole thing. For the first hour, the presentations were a parade of suburban wealth. The first kid up was a boy whose arrogance was entirely funded by his father's money, and we'll call him Bryce. He clicked through a slick slideshow about his dad's life as a corporate lawyer, photos of the man shaking hands with politicians, standing beside a gleaming sports car, grinning on a golf course. My dad, Bryce announced, puffing out his chest, makes sure the biggest companies in the world don't lose their money. He's a winner. And that makes me a winner too. The class applauded politely. The teacher, a woman whose entire approach to her job revolved around never upsetting a wealthy parent, beamed and called it so professional. And Danny sank lower into his plastic chair, his palms sweating. Because all he had in his pocket was a single, slightly crinkled photograph. That was his only visual aid. Danny, the teacher called, her voice taking on that strained, pitying tone she seemed to save just for him. "You're up next, sweetheart." The walk to the front of the room felt like a march to the gallows. He turned to face 24 sets of eyes, some bored. But Bryce's eyes were gleaming with a kind of predatory anticipation, the look of a kid who's already decided he's found his target. Danny pulled out the photograph. His hands were shaking. "For my project," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "I want to talk about my dad. His name is John." "Speak up, Danny," Bryce called from the back, cupping a hand to his ear. "We can't hear you over your cheap shoes squeaking." A few kids snickered. The teacher offered a limp now, let's be respectful, and did absolutely nothing to enforce it. Danny took a breath and said it. "My dad is a biker." For one split second, there was silence. Then a girl tilted her head. "Like, he rides bikes in the Tour de France?" "No," Danny said, standing a little taller. "He rides a motorcycle. A Harley. He builds them, and he rides with his club." And that's when Bryce let out a bark of laughter that shattered the whole room. "A biker? You mean like those fat guys in tight leather pants who block traffic on Sunday mornings? Does he have a little bell on his handlebars?" And the classroom erupted. Not a few giggles. Full-throated, belly-aching laughter. Boys and girls pointing, tears of glee in their eyes. "He's in a club," Bryce mocked. standing up now to perform for his captive audience. What's it called, Danny? The Losers on Wheels? Do they stop for ice cream and hold hands? It's a real club, Danny shouted, his face burning crimson. They're a brotherhood. They protect each other. They sound like a bunch of unemployed hobos, Bryce shot back, high-fiving the kid beside him. My dad says people who ride motorcycles are just criminals who can't afford cars. My dad is not a criminal, Danny yelled, tears welling up. He held the photograph up high, and in that photo, his father stood tall, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, heavy boots, and a leather vest bearing a winged death's head patch. But the kids were too far away and laughing too hard to see any of the details. All they saw was a scared little boy holding up a piece of paper. "All right, class, settle down," the teacher finally said, clapping her hands. She gave Danny a sympathetic, patronizing look. "Thank you for sharing, Danny. I'm sure your father enjoys his hobby. You can sit down now." "It's not a hobby," Danny whispered. But the fight had drained completely out of him. He walked back to his desk, staring at the floor. And for the rest of that day, he was a ghost. At recess, he hid behind the portable classrooms, knees pulled to his chest, wishing with everything in him that he could just vanish. Because here's the thing that hurt the most. He loved his dad. He loved the smell of gasoline and worn leather. But in that classroom, surrounded by polished shoes and slideshows, all he felt was a deep, agonizing shame. Now, you have to understand who his father actually was, because that's where this story turns. The family garage was a sanctuary. Dim fluorescent light, the smell of motor oil and exhaust, the place where Danny's dad spent most of his hours when he wasn't on the road. And his dad, who we'll call John, wasn't a weekend hobbyist. He was a fully patched member of an outlaw motorcycle club, holding the rank of sergeant at arms for his local charter. A giant of a man, arms sleeved in ink, that told a whole life of loyalty and loss. But underneath that intimidating exterior was something simpler. A fiercely devoted single father, for whom Danny was the entire world. When Danny got dropped off that afternoon, he didn't run to the garage like he always did. He kept his head down, walked straight through the front door, and locked himself in his room. And John, who'd been dialing in a carburetor, paused. He wiped the grease off his hands and frowned. Because he knew his son's footsteps better than he knew the idle of his own engine. Something was wrong. He walked into the house, heavy boots thudding on the hardwood, and knocked gently on the bedroom door. "You good, buddy?" "I'm fine," came the muffled, thick voice from the other side. John pushed the door open anyway. His boy was lying face down on the bed, shoulders trembling. "Hey," John said softly, his deep, gravelly voice stripped of all its usual gruffness. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under his weight, and laid one massive, calloused hand on his son's back. "Talk to me. Who do I need to fix?" Danny rolled over, his face red and blotchy, and seeing his father, the man he looked up to more than anyone, only made the tears come harder. They laughed, he choked out. John's jaw tightened. Who laughed? Everyone. The whole class. Danny sat up, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "It was career day. I told them you were a biker. And Bryce said you were just a fat guy in tight pants. He said bikers are unemployed losers who can't afford cars. And the teacher didn't even stop them. She just called it a nice hobby." The silence in the room grew heavy. John didn't yell. He didn't curse, but the anger that flashed in his dark eyes was cold, calculating, and intensely protective. "They called it a hobby," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "I tried to tell them. Danny sobbed. "I tried to show them the picture. I was so embarrassed, Dad. I'm sorry. Don't you ever apologize for them." John gripped his son's shoulders. "You hear me? You hold your head up. Ignorance always speaks loudest when it doesn't know what it's looking at." "But they think you're a joke," Danny whispered. And John stood up, a slow, grim smile spreading across his bearded face. "Well then, I suppose it's time that school got a proper education on what a real club looks like." He walked out to the kitchen, picked up his phone, and dialed. It was answered on the first ring, and his voice shifted from father to sergeant at arms. "We've got a situation," he said. "Nothing violent. But we're going to make a statement. Call the others. Call the whole charter. Tomorrow's the open house at the school. We're going for a ride." The next afternoon, the school was bustling. They'd invited parents to come view the Career Week projects displayed in the gym, and the parking lot was a sea of luxury cars. Inside, parents mingled, sipping lukewarm punch from little paper cups. Bryce's father, a man in a tailored three-piece suit, was holding court near the bleachers, laughing loudly at his own jokes, his son standing beside him, looking smug. And Danny stood alone in a corner by his small display board with that single photograph on it, watching the gym doors, a knot of pure dread twisting in his stomach. His dad had promised to come. And part of him desperately hoped he wouldn't, because he couldn't bear the thought of Bryce and his father humiliating his dad to his face. And then, at 2:45, a sound broke the quiet suburban air. It started as a low, distant thunder, a vibration that seemed to rise up through the asphalt and into the very foundation of the building. The teacher paused mid-sentence. "Is there a storm coming?" one of the mothers asked, nervously fidgeting with her pearl necklace. But the sound grew louder. And it wasn't thunder. It was mechanical, synchronized, guttural, the roar of heavy American iron running on high-octane fuel. The vibration built until the paper cups on the refreshment table started rattling against the plastic. Outside, a convoy had turned onto the pristine tree-lined street leading up to the school. Leading the pack was John on his jet-black machine, the chrome gleaming like polished weapons in the sun. And behind him, riding in tight, disciplined 2x2 formation, were 20 fully patched members of the club. 20 heavy engines roaring in perfect unison, a symphony of organized intimidation. No tight leather pants, no bicycles, heavy denim, scuffed boots, and on every single back, that unmistakable winged death's head, framed by the stark rockers of their charter. They didn't speed. They didn't rev aggressively. They didn't need to. The slow, methodical crawl of 20 heavyweight motorcycles moving as one single, unstoppable organism was enough to stop traffic for 3 blocks. Inside, the parents had drifted toward the glass doors, their conversations dying. Bryce's father pushed to the front, his brow furrowed. What in the world is going on? Who gave a motorcycle gang permission to ride through here? The bikers pulled into the lot and, with a single hand signal from John, executed a flawless, synchronized maneuver, backing their machines into one long, perfect row right in front of the main entrance, completely dwarfing the luxury sedans around them. The engines cut out one by one, leaving a sudden ringing silence broken only by the ticking of hot exhaust pipes cooling in the breeze. John kicked down his stand. He adjusted his cut so the sergeant-at-arms patch sat clearly visible on his chest, looked back at his brothers, got a slow single nod from the big man beside him, and said, "All right, boys, let's go to school." The heavy gym doors swung open with a crash, and the murmur of the open house died instantly. John stepped across the threshold, flanked by his men, 18 more filing in behind. They moved with a predatory grace, a tight phalanx of leather and denim and heavy silver. They brought the outside world in with them. The sharp tang of exhaust, the smell of worn leather, and an undeniable aura of danger this manicured little suburb had never once encountered. The parents, in their designer slacks and cashmere, practically scrambled out of the way. It was as if a pack of wolves had strolled into a dog show. They pressed themselves against the bleachers, eyes wide, breath caught in their throats. And Bryce's father, his face flushing a deep, indignant purple, stepped forward. A man used to ruling boardrooms through sheer arrogance, not about to be intimidated in his own son's elementary school. "Excuse me," he barked, thrusting a finger at John. "You are completely out of line. This is a private event. You and your gang need to leave immediately before I call the police." John didn't break stride. He didn't even glance at the pointed finger. He just stopped, turning his massive frame to look down at the man. Behind him, the big scarred biker crossed his tree-trunk arms into a terrifying smile. "It's a club, not a gang," John said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the dead silent gym. "And this is a parent-teacher open house. I'm a parent. I'm here to see my son's project." The father puffed out his chest, his voice wavering now. "You are frightening the children. The only one frightened here is you, Suit," one of the bikers chimed in. The teacher stepped out from behind a table of papier Mitch volcanoes, her hands shaking. "Mister, we just didn't expect such a large group." "My son told me there was a misunderstanding yesterday," John said, locking eyes with her. "A little confusion about what I do for a living, what my brothers do. And since you were all so interested in careers this week, I brought some visual aids." He turned away from the sputtering father and scanned the room. And there, in the far corner by his flimsy little display board, was Danny, his eyes the size of saucers, shining with a mix of total shock and overwhelming, swelling pride. "Hey, kid," John said softly. And he walked across the gym floor, his heavy boots echoing like gunshots, the 20 bikers following him, parting the sea of terrified parents and wide-eyed children. When they reached the corner, they didn't crowd the boy. They fanned out, forming a massive, impenetrable wall of leather and muscle in a protective semicircle right behind him. John gave his son a single reassuring wink. "I heard some people thought your project was a joke," John said, turning back to face the crowd, his eyes settling on Bryce, who was now hiding entirely behind his father's legs and looking like he might be sick. "I heard somebody say bikers are just a bunch of unemployed hobos who can't afford cars." The silence was so total you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. "Yesterday," John began, his voice a low rumble that demanded absolute attention, "my son stood up here. He held up this little picture and he told you his father was a biker. And you laughed. You looked at his worn-out sneakers. You looked at his faded jacket. And you decided he was beneath you. You looked at the word biker and you judged him. You judged me. And you turned my son's pride into a punchline." Bryce's father, feeling the room's attention shifting toward him, tried to salvage his authority. He straightened his tie, though his hands were visibly trembling. "Now see here. We are respectable people. My son simply pointed out that in the real world, success is measured by professional achievement, not by riding motorcycles and wearing gang colors." John didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the man, completely invading his space until the lawyer backed up against a folding table. "Let's talk about the real world," John said, dangerously calm. "Your boy bragged yesterday about how you protect corporate money, how you find loopholes for billionaires. Said that makes you a winner. So let me ask you something. When the market crashes, or when some younger, hungrier lawyer wants your corner office, how many of those corporate clients are going to step in front of a bullet for you? How many are going to feed your family if you break your back tomorrow? The man opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That's what I thought, John muttered, and turned his back on him in a total display of dismissal. He gestured to the wall of men behind him. You called us unemployed hobos. You called us criminals. So let's do some proper introductions for Career Week. He pointed to the towering man on his left. This one here. The one your son would call a loser. He served 2 tours overseas as a combat medic, spent years pulling shattered kids out of burning vehicles, and when he finally came home, he didn't get a corner office. He got a wheelchair, a mountain of medical debt, and a government that forgot his name. Couldn't even get his own chair through his own front door. And you know who fought to fix that? You know who spent 3 weeks pouring concrete and hammering wood to build him a ramp so he could get into his own kitchen? We did. Because we don't leave our brothers behind. He pointed to a sharply dressed man with a gray beard near the back. That one owns the biggest custom steel fabrication plant in the state. Employs over 80 local men and women. And you know who he hires? The blue-collar workers that suits like you recommend laying off to pad a quarterly profit margin. Finally, he pointed to a heavily tattooed man. And him? He grew up in the foster system, thrown away before he was even 18. Today he runs a non-profit shop downtown. Pulls at-risk kids off the street, puts a wrench in their hands, teaches them a trade so they don't end up dead or in a cell. The parents stared, completely paralyzed. The comfortable little story they'd swallowed whole was being dismantled right in front of them. The mothers who'd been clutching their pearls were now looking at these scarred men with sudden, shocked reverence. John stepped back into the center of the semicircle and tapped the patch on his chest. You people make money, he declared, his voice rising to fill the cavernous gym. We make brothers. You live in a world where your whole worth is printed on a bank statement, and you teach your kids that stepping on the little guy makes them a winner. But a real hero isn't a man in a suit who knows how to exploit a tax loophole. A hero is a man who stands by you when the rest of the world turns its back. A hero is loyalty, blood, sweat, and devotion. And that is exactly what this patch means. The silence afterward was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. And then John turned away from the stunned crowd and walked back to his son. He dropped heavily onto one knee, bringing himself level with the boy, and gripped his shoulders. And all that coldness in his eyes vanished completely, replaced by a fierce, overwhelming love. You listen to me, kid, he said softly, though the silent room let his words carry. You never, ever hang your head. Not for them. Not for anybody. You've got an entire army of uncles standing right behind you who would ride through a wall of fire for you. And don't you ever let anyone in a cheap suit tell you that you aren't the richest kid in this room. And the shame that had crushed Danny the day before just evaporated. The tears came, spilling down his cheeks, but they were tears of pure pride now. He threw his small arms around his father's thick neck and buried his face in his shoulder. I love you, Dad, he whispered fiercely. Love you too, son, John murmured, holding him tight before pulling back and ruffling his hair. Then he stood, towering once more, and looked over at the teacher, who was leaning against a desk like she'd just survived an earthquake. Grade his project fairly, John said, the warning underneath the words unmistakable. I'd hate to think there was any lingering bias in this classroom. She swallowed hard and nodded frantically. And just as flawlessly as they'd entered, the 20 men turned on their heels, the heavy thud of their boots echoing through the gym as they marched back out through the parted crowd of silent, humbled parents and into the bright afternoon sun. Seconds later, 20 engines roared to life. The ground shook one last time as the convoy pulled out in perfect formation, the thunder fading slowly into the distance. And here's my favorite part. When the bell rang to dismiss the kids, Danny didn't slink out the back door hoping to avoid the bullies. He walked straight out the front, head held high, his scuffed sneakers squeaking proudly across the polished floor. Bryce was standing near the buses. But as Danny approached, the boy looked down at the pavement, unable to even meet his eyes. Because Danny wasn't just the quiet kid with the biker dad anymore. He was the kid with an entire fiercely loyal brotherhood standing squarely behind him, and in the brutal, unforgiving hierarchy of the schoolyard, he'd just become completely untouchable. So let me leave you with this. We are so quick, all of us, to read a person by their surface. The worn sneakers, the faded jacket, the leather and the tattoos, and the rumble of an engine. We glance at the label, and we think we know the whole story. But this one is a reminder of how often we get it exactly backwards. The man the whole room had written off as a joke turned out to be surrounded by veterans and business owners and people who pull throwaway kids off the street and give them a future. And the man in the three-piece suit, the one everyone was taught to admire, turned out to have nothing real standing behind him at all. True wealth was never in the bank statement. It's in who shows up for you when the world turns its back. So here's my question, and I really do want to hear your answer. Have you ever been judged for something that didn't fit the mold? Or watched someone you love get written off unfairly? Tell me about it down in the comments, because I read every single one, and those are the stories that stay with me. If this one gave you chills, share it with someone who needs the reminder not to judge a person by the label on the outside. And hit that subscribe button, because the next story I've got lined up hits just as hard. Until then, never forget. The people the world is quickest to laugh at are sometimes the ones with the deepest loyalty of all. And loyalty like that makes you richer than any corner office ever could.